Thanks everyone for coming, and I'm really honored to be here and to be starting off the first of, I think, 2 exciting days. Because I realized I was first on the agenda, I thought what I would do is provide a kind of big picture overview, particularly a historical overview of the idea of urban metabolism. I'm a social scientist, so that's my bias, and I'm going to present a social science history. But I think it's going to be one that can speak to concerns of ecologists, urban designers, and hopefully a kind of range of people who are interested in the connection between humans and the natural environment within cities. So the idea that I'm going to explore today is that over the last 100 years, the concept of metabolism has served as a kind of organizing metaphor in the social sciences for the relationship between humans and the natural environment within cities. And specifically, my belief is that if we look at the way that the concept of metabolism has changed in terms of what it's meant to describe, which humans, which environment, which city, that actually is going to tell us a lot about changes, and particularly kind of changes in the boundaries of how cities relate to the natural world, and about how we humans understand those relationships. And so kind of just as a few words of background, the idea of metabolism in an urban context, I think is most commonly used to describe material flows through cities, right? The way that humans kind of take up natural resources and transform them, and the idea that the city is the key location where that transformation occurs. But we also use urban metabolism as a way to describe the politics of nature within cities, particularly questions of unequal access. Who has access to environmental goods, and who unfortunately has too much access to environmental bads? And lastly, I think we can use urban metabolism as a way to think about kind of fundamental questions about what is a city, what isn't a city, right? So thinking about questions of the urban-rural interface, of how the natural world gets kind of transformed into the social materials of modern urban life. So what I'm going to do today is, I want to say one more thing with a bit of a kind of provocative graffiti from Milan here, is that I think urban metabolism particularly gives us a good way to think about what I think of as one of the kind of key transitions that needs explaining in the urban social sciences and the social sciences of the natural environment as well, which is a transition that we've witnessed over the last 40 or 50 years from a kind of widespread thinking of cities as sustainability problems, right? Which is the, this guy eating nature and producing, in a certain sense, the city as a result. A kind of transition away from that understanding of cities in environmental terms towards one here. This is a brochure for an eco-city development in Tianjin in China. Is meant to make a very strong case that cities and the natural environment go together. And actually, we see this reflected in policy terms as well, right? That cities can perhaps save the planet or be kind of leading actors in the transition to a more sustainable global future. So this transition, I think, needs explaining, and it's one of the main themes informing the work that I do in general. And I'm going to, I think, hopefully contribute a little bit to that today by taking you on a kind of 120 year or so history of the way that urban metabolism has been used in the social sciences. So the agenda is, first of all, I want to kind of give some background about what metabolism thinking is meant to do and kind of how it contributes to urban analysis. And then I want to do a brief stylized history of 3 kind of eras of metabolism thinking and metabolism scholarship over the course, basically, of the 20th century. And then finally, I want to wrap up by thinking about, kind of some new directions, what we can make use of from the concept of urban metabolism today to confront contemporary urban, environmental, and political concerns. Okay, so what does metabolism thinking do for urban analysis? Well, I don't know if, probably in this room, everybody knows this stuff, but just in case we don't, the term metabolism, which comes from German, was first used in the early 19th century to describe chemical changes within living cells. But actually, it was not long before it kind of acquired its long-standing dual meaning of change kind of within cells, but also within larger systems. So, although the first use of metabolism was to talk about change processes like literally within the cells in our body, it was very quickly appropriated to describe kind of overall concepts of human health and human kind of medical change. And what we see is that the term jumped over to the social sciences fairly quickly after, and also kind of acquired this dual meaning of kind of change in very small units, as well as understanding how small units relate to larger social systems. And it was actually Karl Marx who was the first person to kind of appropriate the idea of metabolism in the social sciences. And he had kind of two things on his mind. The first was using metabolism as a way to describe, in kind of broad and often trans-historical senses, the way that humans appropriate nature and transform it into society through labor. But he secondly used metabolism as a very kind of deliberate metaphor to describe how commodities are produced and circulate through capitalism. So it kind of had a more kind of directly material meaning, as well as a more metaphorical social meaning. I think that it's fair to say that now, if you kind of look at the scope of the way that we've used this idea of urban metabolism historically, what you see is that above all, it's used to emphasize in an urban context the dynamic and system properties of urban environments, right? So on the one hand, first of all, we use metabolism to think about what are the conditions for change and for transformation and for growth within an urban system. You know, one of the kind of the key stylized facts, if we look at the history of capitalist urbanization, is that cities grow and they transform. And metabolism's been a very kind of fruitful metaphor for thinking through those transformations. The second thing it's been useful for is understanding the boundaries of urban systems, what's within and what's without. And I think particularly, as we're going to see when we do look at the history, metabolism has been a very helpful concept for understanding the way that these boundaries and the scales of urban systems change over time. Third, I want to say that the idea of urban metabolism draws our attention to who gets to participate, who's kind of enrolled voluntarily or involuntarily within the processes of social and natural transformation that shape cities. And also, you know, who benefits in the sense of who comes out in nice positions and who comes out in not so nice positions from the processes of socio-environmental change, which we describe with the idea of metabolism. And then the last thing I want to suggest, and here I'll need to take a few more words of explanation, is that urban metabolism thinking can draw our attention to the partitioning or the separation of the kind of the green and gray aspects of an urban system. And so what I'm thinking about here is that a kind of a long-standing aesthetic fact about the production of urban environments is a separation between what we kind of things that look green and things that look gray, and a whole kind of bundle of associations that go with that, right? So kind of, mapping this directly into urban terms, that, cities are big, dense, human, social, bustling environments, we call gray, and then that outside the city, the thing that we kind of contrast the city with is the domain of green, of nature, of kind of non-human space. But the fact is that this relationship between what's green and what's gray is one that itself has changed historically as well. And what we want to do is we want to understand how, how that boundary between green and gray, between what we think of as kind of nature per se and what we think of the social realm, society per se, how that boundary changes and is contested and ultimately is transformed. So I'm going to try to tell a bit of that story, and what I'm going to do is it's a very brief history, and it's going to leave out a lot of the complexity inevitably. But what I want to do is talk about three specific eras of metabolism thinking in the urban social sciences in the 20th century. And what I hope to do with this is both to give you a sense of the kind of the breadth of the way that the idea of metabolism has been used historically in an urban context, but also to tell a story of transformation of our ideas about how cities and the natural environment relate, and also transformation in reality of how cities and the natural environment relate. And where I'm going to start is 100 plus years ago with what is the first use of the idea of metabolism to describe cities, which is the Chicago School of Sociology and the kind of associated discipline of human ecology. And before I get into the Chicago School themselves, I want to give you a quote from a New York social reformer, Lawrence Vaylor. So he was active in the kind of the housing movement around the turn of the 20th century, the same time period that Jacob Riis, this is a photograph of the slums in New York, Jacob Riis published these incredible photographs in a book called How the Other Half Lives that really drew attention to the modern conditions of life for the industrial working class in New York City. And Wehler was motivated, he was one of a number of social reformers motivated by the problems of modern industrial life in the city, and had a whole bunch of proposals, particularly around how to build better housing. But I want to just give you a quote from one of his writings describing the problem of modern industrial life in the city. He says, "The city may not inappropriately be compared to the human organism. Its streets are the veins and arteries through which the blood circulates, its parks are the lungs through which it breathes, and civic spirit and enlightened public sentiment are the directing intelligence which controls its movements and its life." Then he goes on to say that the gradual growth of some vile slum, the congestion there of a degraded semi-criminal population, stops the circulation of the city's healthful currents, and ultimately gangrene sets in and the offending portions have to be cut out with the surgeon's knife. The blood once poisoned is never entirely healthy again, and it's only a little while before a second operation is necessary. So I like this quotation not because it's unique, in the sense that, in fact, it captures a mode of thinking that had, by the turn of the century, was starting to become quite prevalent, which is the idea that we can understand urban systems in very close analogy to kind of biological systems. But what I like about this one is just that I think it makes the case so clearly. Now, Wehler himself, he wasn't he was a housing reformer, but actually the emergence of urban sociology, of human ecology, which happened around the exact same time in Chicago, also mobilized very similar biological metaphors to understand the growth and change of urban systems. And particularly, the Chicago School of Sociology made use of the concept of metabolism. So this is the pretty famous, at least in North America, diagram that Ernest Burgess made of the city. And the book that that this was from was called The City, right? It wasn't. By the way, this is a map of Chicago, basically. But the book wasn't called Chicago; it was called The City, because the Chicago School of Sociology was aiming for a kind of general understanding of cities per se. And so Burgess had this concentric circles idea of the way that cities function and the way that they develop. But on top of that, he also had. He proposed that we could understand the processes of change and of growth of cities directly in terms of metabolism. So he says urban growth may even be maybe even more fundamentally stated as the resultant of processes of organization and disorganization, processes of metabolism in the human body. And what he had in mind here was the idea that, much like the metabolism of the human body, there are kind of a set of tendencies leading towards order and to growth, and then a set of tendencies leading in the opposite direction, towards disorder and breakdown. And just in the same way that Wehler talked about a cancer, kind of a blood poison, characterizing a slum in the city, Burgess also had the similar ideas about kind of sociability and unsociability in urban spaces, that kind of good circulations and transformations of people within cities kind of produce good human environments, kind of mental environments, social environments, and that bad processes of circulation and growth and transformation within cities produce bad human environments. We've also got just one last quote here from Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son of the park designer and himself a kind of an important early thinker in urban planning and urban studies, who made a similar analogy. So, human ecology and the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, they use this idea of metabolism to understand the change of cities, particularly of industrialization, modernization, right? The rural-urban transformation that was occurring throughout the kind of the emerging capitalist world. And I think that at the beginning of the talk, I said that there were the kind of four ways that we can understand metabolism's contribution to urban social science. We've got conditions for change, scale and boundaries, participants, and then green and gray. So to kind of run through that list with respect to the Chicago School of Sociology, the first thing to note is that they understood the conditions for change in an urban system as being internal to that system in a very profound way, which is to say that Chicago at the time was a city of immigrants. But basically, the Chicago School kind of took for granted that people would show up. And what was important was what happened once they did show up. And so that's why they focused a lot on neighborhood dynamics, on questions of housing, because for them, the conditions of change for a city were about kind of how different groups of people within the city related to each other. So it was a very kind of internally focused idea of urban metabolism. Secondly, and kind of relatedly, it understood the city as a self-contained system. And the thing that's interesting about this is that the Chicago School made extensive use of biological and ecological metaphors in their analysis. I mean, the kind of the broad school of thought was called human ecology, right? But actually, they almost never mentioned nature in any kind of like literal sense, in the sense of the natural environment. So this was strictly understood as a metaphorical relationship, that there's a natural world, natural metabolisms and natural ecosystems, and there's a completely separate human world, and we can understand the human world by a kind of applying metaphors from the natural world. But the city was understood as a very self-contained system. The participants in this urban metabolism of the Chicago School were understood as both individual humans and particularly social groups. This was the birth of kind of neighborhood analysis, neighborhood studies. And then lastly, in terms of what's green and what's gray, the city was understood as a social system, and the boundaries of that social system were exactly the boundaries of the city. Outside that city, you have the natural world. So gray in the city, green outside the city. So now I want to leap forward 40 or 50 years and discuss the kind of second era of metabolism thinking in the urban social sciences. And this is the idea of industrial ecology. So here's a kind of a pretty classic diagram capturing the field of industrial ecology, which is basically concerned with how materials flow from the natural world and are kind of transformed through human agency into the kind of the building blocks of society. So we've got here, this is an urban metabolism study from an industrial ecologist in Sydney, of the city of Sydney. And what we've got is a set of raw materials. We've got the wood, the food, the water, and the fuel. And we can quantify those. And then this is the amount of raw materials necessary to build and sustain the city of Sydney. So this stuff is absorbed into Sydney, and then it's transformed into society, it's transformed into the city. And then what comes out the other side? Well, it's the bad stuff, right? The waste. So we've got the pollution, we've got air pollution, water pollution, solid waste, and then waste heat as well. Now, as it turns out, one of the early of these kinds of metabolism studies, so I kind of dug this up, sorry that the image isn't very good, is from Brussels, right? So this is a similar, kind of a more visually imposing idea of the same thing, but again, taking the city itself and understanding it as the site of transformation of the natural world into the social world. The very first of these kinds of studies came from the 1960s, a scientist named Abel Woolman, who wrote an article called The Metabolism of Cities. And he didn't look at a specific city, but more the general proposition that the role of cities in a certain sense is converting the natural world into the social world. And here's just one last diagram, which makes the point that it's not, the industrial ecology perspective on urban metabolism isn't simply limited to just a transformation of kind of raw materials into physical objects, but also into kind of a social world, right? So from the same study as the Sydney one, we've got the resource inputs, and then we've got, waste outputs are produced, but also livability is produced. In other words, sociality, the social world, is also a kind of a product of this transformation, metabolic transformation of raw materials in the city. The underlying thinking of urban metabolism in the School of Industrial Ecology, I think, is really well summarized by the environmentalist Girardet, who says, cities transform raw materials into finished products. They convert food, fuels, forest products, minerals, water, and human energy into buildings, manufactured goods, and financial and political power, all the components of civilization. Okay? So, I think we can see already a pretty large kind of jump from the human ecology, Chicago sociology idea of metabolism as a way to characterize the kind of human social processes operating within cities, to now the industrial ecology perspective, which sees cities as the sites for the kind of large-scale production of human civilization, by taking the natural world, feeding into cities, and out comes the bad stuff, the waste, but also the good stuff, the society. So if we think about how we understand the conditions for change from an industrial ecology perspective, you see an emphasis in this literature on a distinction between linear and circular metabolisms, right? So linear metabolisms are, I don't know if I can go back here, but they're the ones where, you pull in the waste, you pull in the raw materials, and out comes the waste on the other end. It's a line. Circular metabolisms are the idea that we can incorporate recycling and reuse, that some of the kind of bad outputs from the city can be kind of repurposed to serve as inputs again. It's a more sustainable mode of production and consumption. As far as the scale and boundaries of the city, what we see from the industrial ecology perspective is that, the idea of the city as the kind of the site of society, but very intimately connected with the non-city, non-human natural world. That's where the resources come from and that's where the waste goes. I would argue that we see that as far as the participants in industrial ecology goes, we see a kind of a big emphasis on the city, cities as policy actors, but less attention to politics per se in the sense of kind of struggles over who gets what and why. I think that's something that's changing, but I think that it kind of, historically speaking, that we could say that about industrial ecology. And then lastly, in terms of where the green is and where the gray is, under the industrial ecology idea of metabolism, we see cities as the things that are kind of consuming and polluting nature. So cities are are gray in the middle of and they're kind of connected to the outside of the city green area, both through their consumption of resources and through their production of waste. Okay, so lastly, we have the final of my kind of 3 tours, this tour of different uses of the idea of urban metabolism in the social sciences. And this is from the much more recent field of urban political ecology, where we see urban metabolism used as a way to understand the politics of how nature is taken up, is transformed, is fought over, and is contested and is used in cities, what is called, what Eric Swingedow called Socio Nature. This idea of socio nature, which was defined by Swingedow as a kind of hybrid concept, trying to make the point that what we think of as society is always reliant and in a relationship with the natural world, but that's also true for nature itself, right? That nature itself doesn't have a kind of pre-human or non-human separate independent existence, that society and nature are always kind of in dialogue and in tension with each other. So he proposes the concept of socio nature to describe this. And in the edited collection on urban political ecology from a decade or so ago, it's defined socio nature, a glass of water, an orange, or the steel and concrete embedded in buildings, right? A very kind of clear attempt to say some things that we think of as very clearly natural and some things that are very clearly human and social. This is together as socio nature. Urban political ecology understands the city as not just the site where raw materials are taken up and transformed into society, but also in an important sense is the kind of product of metabolism, in the sense of all sorts of different actors, human and non-human, contesting what the city is meant to look like, who gets to participate, and why. And so the result is kind of pretty strong connections between the urban political ecology approach to metabolism and the environmental justice movement, which wants to draw attention to the fact that nature is distributed in very uneven ways throughout the city. Some people's experience of nature in the city is parks and trees, and other people's experience of nature in the city is pollution and industrial contaminants. And that we don't want to just limit the way we understand the natural environment in the cities to the nice green stuff, but we also need to understand the not so nice stuff and realize that the way we access both of those things, the goods and the bads, are the result of political struggles. So the result is that if we look at what are the conditions for change from an urban political ecology understanding of metabolism, it's uneven spatial development, that cities grow in uneven ways, kind of systematically, with very clear winners and losers from different social, economic, and environmental processes. We also see a distinctive and I think really exciting focus on cities as socio-natural systems, which is to say that nature is not something outside the city boundaries. It's something that is constitutively part of how the city is made and how the city exists. But I would say at the same time, we see in urban political ecology relatively little attention to what actually is happening outside the city. And I'll return to that point in the conclusion. Third, we see that from an urban political ecology perspective, who are the participants in urban metabolism? Well, first of all, nature is an active participant. And we see here the influence of actor network theory, assemblage theory, but also a key concern with inequalities, with power and resource inequalities, and how those structure who's able to participate unevenly in different forms of access to the environment in cities. And then lastly, in terms of where the green is and where the gray is, urban political ecology gives us this very distinctive idea of the city as a site for the reconfiguration of both society and nature. It's not simply the place where society is produced in contrast to the natural world, but it's a site for very distinctive stagings and transformations of both the natural world and the social world. Okay, so that's the quick history. I don't know how much time I have. A few minutes. Okay, good. I only have a few things left to say, so that's perfect. What I want to do now is kind of take this story, this historical story over the last 100 years into the present and kind of think about what we can do with it. And the first thing I want to do is just give you a couple of diagrams to illustrate the kind of meta-narrative of the history. This is the Human Ecology Chicago School idea of urban metabolism. You've got the city, and it's the realm, the social gray world, and you've got nature outside of it, which is the green world. And we can understand these two worlds in relationship, in kind of analogy to each other, but urban metabolism is what happens in here, according to the Chicago School of Sociology. The industrial ecology perspective, kind of, I think, really represents a big step forward in integrating our understanding of the natural environment into urban analysis, into urban planning, into urban politics, by making explicit the connections between the city and the natural world, both in terms of the kind of the material inputs to the city from the natural world, and then the kind of the waste outputs back into nature. And then lastly, we've got urban political ecology. The idea is that the city is both the gray and the green. They coexist, and the process of urban metabolism is a process that kind of mutually transforms these two dimensions. But then outside the city, I think we know a little bit less. So what I think of as a kind of the frontier of using the idea of metabolism to push forward urban thinking is really about capturing both of these things. Capturing the kind of industrial ecology insight that cities only exist because of their relationship with resources and materials from the natural world, with the urban political ecology insight that nature doesn't kind of cease being nature when it hits the city boundary, that how nature is kind of transformed within cities is a kind of fundamental part of how urban politics works and how cities ultimately become spaces for human life. And so the question is kind of how we can do both of these things. I don't know for sure, but I'm really inspired by the regional scientist Brian Barry back in the 60s. He had this pretty interesting definition of cities. He said cities as systems within systems of cities. Drawing attention to the fact that cities themselves have these kind of system properties, but are always embedded within larger systems. And he was understanding this from a kind of regional science perspective, the larger systems of interurban systems of connecting multiple cities. But I think we can actually apply that insight to urban metabolism thinking, to think about how the natural world and the human world interact, which is to understand cities as sites of socio-natural transformation that themselves are embedded within multiple different scales within other systems of socio-natural transformation. I think what this would call for, and I think what we're actually seeing in kind of current metabolism research, is comparative analysis. In other words, understanding the kind of differential positioning of different city systems within socio-natural processes, as well as more attention to this question of scale. The idea that the urban nature doesn't end at the boundaries of the city. It would also entail, I think we're seeing increasing methodological sophistication, making sure we get the numbers right if we are going to try to measure resource flows moving through urban systems. And then lastly, kind of decomposing all the parallel and unequal metabolisms that characterize the kind of broader interurban and socio-natural system. That it's not just the case that some neighborhoods are polluted and other neighborhoods get parks, but that's actually a characteristic of the urban system on a global scale, right? Some cities get to design iPhones and other cities have to build them and get the pollution that's associated with that. So we kind of want to think about those kind of unequal metabolisms. At the same time, the thing that, and this is where I'm going to wrap up, I think that we've still got some tension, some questions about how we use urban metabolism. First of all, whether or not this metaphor, which consistently has been used to characterize kind of growth and change, is really appropriate when we know that cities don't necessarily grow and change in positive ways. And actually, many cities don't grow. And if our kind of metaphors and our conceptual tools for understanding urban systems are ones that are kind of premised on ongoing transformation and growth, that has the kind of the risk of pathologizing other kinds of urban conditions that don't necessarily involve that growth. I also want to draw attention to whether or not we've done enough to really think past the binaries about urban and non-urban spaces, and that ideas of metabolism which take nature and turn them into cities kind of risk re-fortifying the wall in conceptual terms that divides the city from the non-city. And then last, I just want to call attention to the question of kind of which people and which resource flows matter. That that urban metabolisms kind of involve people in different and unequal ways, and we need to pay attention to that. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I look forward to a good discussion today.